So what we're going to start with is a discussion of one of the ideas that have been put forth by one of the gods, if you like, of visualization, Tufte, and you will hear his name a lot anytime you talk about visualization. There are a lot of very good books and experts in the field. We'll talk about a couple of them as well. So let me start with what I hope when you look at this you'll realize is something not to do. So the New York Times, which nowadays does absolutely fantastic visualizations, started off, you know, a little bit on the dodgy side. To be fair, it was in 1978, and they've, as I said, done a lot of very nice things since then. But take a look at that first visual on the road, and of course, one of the cardinal rules of visualization is you have to understand what they're trying to tell you. And you take a look at that, and you have to really struggle to understand what they're trying to say. The first problem is that it's distorted, because it's cute with the road, but it looks like it's increasing, whereas what they're trying to get across is that fuel economy over time, as the years have gone on, fuel economy has increased, and the volume is not proportional to the degrees, and then the gaps are not consistent. So it's a very muddled graph, showing increase instead of decrease, volume, and so on. If you take a look at the second picture, it commits the same kind of sins. And what you'll see is they're talking about the shrinking family doctor, but what they're actually showing is an increase in a ratio. So that degree is confusing, and then when you look at the actual scale, the volume and the scale are also distorted. So one of the things that you see is, obvious things is, volume is not a particularly good way of conveying information. Having too much cutesy stuff is confusing, and what you want is that a message can be understood relatively quickly. So your intuitive sense from looking at these is, you know, let's keep things relatively simple, relatively clear. So what are those principles? You can see on the next slide, you've got a house that's designed to look like a duck. This is not the way in which you want to convey information. You want to think long and hard. So this is what Tufte came up with, and he talks about graphical excellence. You don't need me to read those lines to you. You're perfectly capable of reading the points to yourself, but essentially clarity, figure out what you're going to say, distill it to one or two key points and make it as clear as possible. And make sure that you're telling the truth about data. You've all seen pictures where the axis is skewed or distorted to make a point, or you don't have the zero and so on. Make sure that what you're actually saying matches what the data are telling you visually. You'll notice another one of the points that Tufte makes is a very low ink to data ratio. What that really means is keep it simple, stupid. So reiterating that in that next slide, we're going to say don't have any distractions. You'll hear the term chart junk a great deal when you talk about visualization. That duck was chart junk. The pictures of the doctor were chart junk. So reinforce what you expect to see and keep it very clear. So take a look at the next slide. And all of us obviously have used bar charts to some extent in Excel. And think about this notion of conveying the right set of information and minimizing the amount of junk. So if you take a look at the first bar chart to the left, you'll see that it's very useful in the sense that it does convey information about the relative height or the relative importance of the different features. The junk that's in there, and I'm going to pause for a second while you look at that picture and try and figure out what I'm going to say is junk, And of course the junk is colors. Those colors have no additional information associated with them. So you could have conveyed exactly the same information simply from the height. You don't need the colors. If you take a look at the right-hand picture, you can see that just because Excel can do something doesn't mean that you should do it. So it is true that Excel will allow you to go 3D, explode, rotate, bias, but really if you don't have to do it, don't do it. So that volume, anytime you see volume in a picture, you should be very dubious about the value of that, because the human eye finds it very difficult to deal with volume. Tufte is famous for his views on pie charts, which I share. In general, if you can avoid pie charts, avoid them for the same reason. And in this particular case, the volume is uninformative, the shadows are uninformative, the tilt is uninformative. Just keep it simple. They could have conveyed the information with the bar chart without the colors. I said there were several other very useful books. This book by Kirk is an excellent book if you have abundant time and money to go out and purchase it and read through. It's an easy read and it makes a lot of very good points. So we kind of told you what not to do, and at a high level told you what to do. In other words, keep it simple, make it clear, and so on. Turns out that there are some underlying principles that you can use just to help guide you, rather in addition to kind of those high level things. So a very good book by Munzner called Visualization Analysis and Design is another book that might be useful for you to go and take a look at. And what she points out, and I think this is a very, very helpful construct upon which to rely, and that is to say every visualization can be split into 2 points, marks and channels. So let me go through each of those in turn. So a mark can be zero-dimensional, in other words, just a point, or it could be one-dimensional, which is a line, or it could be two-dimensional, which is an area, which actually has an aspect of a channel as well, but let's talk about that next. So you can use points, you can use lines, or you can use area to convey information. So then you can also use channels. In other words, if you have an item, let's say a business or a geography or something in particular, you want to convey attributes. Now remember at the very beginning, I talked about our natural brain tendency to group things or categorize things. So what those channels essentially are doing is a way to signal to your brain how things ought to be grouped. So on this slide we talk about some of them. Color, people automatically group colors. So if you have red and blue, you're going to mentally group the red together and mentally group the blue together. If you have shades, for example, you're going to group blue shades or light shades together and dark shades together. So color is a way in which our brains group things. So that's conveying information about similarities. The same thing about shapes. I talked about Piaget. Kids will group things of similar shapes. So a natural way for you to present information about similar entities is to use the same shape. Another way of doing it, if you're conveying information about the size of something or the relative position, is to either convey that horizontally or vertically, or by the length of a line. So each way in which you're channeling that information is visually conveying something to people. And then the next slide kind of goes into that in a little bit more detail. You could use this as a cheat sheet, very handy to have in front of you when you're trying to decide what is the best way of conveying information. I should say at this point, when you're dealing with colors, if you're in the government or if you're working for a government agency, you need to be aware of colorblindness and 508 compliance. But so that quite often what people will use rather than just bold colors, is just use, for example, the luminance or the saturation, because colorblind people can pick up on that as well. So, so that next slide just unpacks that storyline a little bit more. So then you have to be careful, again, the Tufte principles, don't overdo it. So if you take a look at the next slide, you see a beautiful example to the left of how color can help you group things. So you've got red and blue, and then you can see that the blue group dots belong together and the red dots belong together. You can see that shape is not quite as clear in terms of being able to group, but it does tell you something. That's the middle graph. And then you can see with the redundant encoding, which is the last slide, last picture, that it's redundant. So you've got all the squares are blue and all the circles are red. So then you're looking at it and saying, why do I have both blue and square and red and circle? So that really is too much information, because then you puzzle a little bit as to why someone has gone to the trouble of kind of providing two pieces of information just to convey, or two visual cues only to convey one piece of information. You can use color to pop out, so you can emphasize particular things that you're interested in emphasizing. So you remember at the in the first segment, we had the number 8 pop out to highlight that number 8 was important. You can see how colors are being used in this set of graphs to make particular activities pop out. So that's another way in which they can be used.